Humans terrified the rest of the galaxy, and there was a damn good reason. Douglas Gordon marched into the massive Galactic Council chamber, his combat boots thudding on the polished metal floor. The room was dimly lit, with representatives of various alien species seated in a semicircle around a central podium. Insectoid craniums clicked their mandibles, reptilian saurians flicked their tongues, and the ethereal luminari glowed softly. Korvac, the towering Krenim leader, fixed his compound eyes on Douglas. "Human, we have summoned you here because a grave threat looms over the galaxy. Zarx, a rogue Krenim scientist, has stolen a prototype quantum nullifier weapon. If activated, it can erase entire star systems from existence." Douglas crossed his arms. "And you want me to clean up your mess because your species is known for resilience, adaptability, and unorthodox thinking, the very traits that make you unpredictable to the galactic community." Korvac's mandibles twitched. "You must retrieve the nullifier and neutralize Zarx. This mission is top secret. Widespread panic must be prevented. The continued existence of your species and access to advanced council technology depend on it. Zarx is protected by an army on a fortified space station. You'll be granted our best stealth ship and weapons." Korvac held out a spherical device. "This quantum key can deactivate the nullifier. The fate of countless lives depends on you, human." Douglas took the key, a grim smile on his face. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant to rely on a human to save its collective ass. This was why aliens feared his kind, and for damn good reason. When humans got involved, the universe trembled. Douglas powered up the Phantom's engines, punching in the coordinates for the Zalos system. He sat back in the pilot's chair, taking a deep breath. The weight of the mission settled heavily on his shoulders, but he pushed the doubts aside. He was the right man for the job, and he would see it through. As the ship hurtled through hyperspace, Douglas pored over the scant intelligence the Galactic Council had provided. Zarx's space station schematics rotated on the holographic display, revealing a heavily fortified structure bristling with weapons, emplacements, and shielding. The Krenim scientist had spared no expense in securing his base of operations. The Phantom dropped out of hyperspace on the fringes of the Zalos system. Immediately, the ship's sensors lit up with warnings. A Krenim patrol fleet orbited the space station, their ships arrayed in a defensive formation. Douglas's fingers danced across the controls, activating the Phantom's cloaking device. The ship shimmered and vanished from sight, slipping past the patrol fleet undetected. Douglas guided the Phantom towards the space station's outer hull, searching for a suitable entry point. He found a maintenance airlock and maneuvered the ship into position. With a hiss of hydraulics, he extended the docking clamps and secured the Phantom to the station's hull. Donning his tactical gear, Douglas grabbed a plasma torch from the ship's armory. He cycled the airlock and stepped onto the station's hull, magnetic boots keeping him anchored. The torch flared to life, its white-hot flame cutting through the reinforced metal like butter. Within minutes, Douglas had carved an opening large enough to slip through. Inside the station, Douglas found himself in a dimly lit maintenance corridor. He consulted the schematics on his wrist-mounted display, plotting a route to Zarx's likely location. He moved swiftly and silently, his enhanced senses alert for any signs of danger. The labyrinthine corridors twisted and turned, forcing Douglas to navigate carefully. He avoided patrols of Krenim soldiers and skirted around security drones, his cloaking suit rendering him nearly invisible. But as he approached the station's central core, an alarm suddenly pierced the air. Red lights flashed, and the sound of booted feet echoed through the corridors. Douglas pressed himself against a wall, his hand tightening on his blaster. A group of heavily armed Krenim soldiers rounded the corner, their weapons trained on his position. Douglas's eyes widened as he realized the soldiers were not carrying standard Krenim weapons. Instead, they wielded advanced energy rifles, their sleek black barrels glowing with an ominous red light. He barely had time to react as the soldiers opened fire, crimson bolts of energy sizzling through the air. The human operative dove for cover, his personal shield flickering under the onslaught. The energy bolts penetrated the shield, scorching the wall behind him. Douglas gritted his teeth, realizing that Zarx had equipped his troops with weaponry designed to counter Council technology, but Douglas was not one to back down from a fight. He leaned out from behind cover, his own blaster spitting blue bolts of plasma. His superior training and lightning-fast reflexes gave him an edge, allowing him to outmaneuver the Krenim soldiers. The corridor erupted into a fierce firefight, energy bolts crisscrossing the space between the combatants. Douglas moved with fluid grace, dodging and weaving as he returned fire. One by one, the Krenim soldiers fell, their armor smoking from the precise shots of the human operative. As the last soldier crumpled to the ground, Douglas paused to catch his breath. He approached one of the fallen Krenim and picked up an energy rifle, examining it closely. The weapon bore Zark's personal insignia, confirming that the rogue scientist had been developing his own advanced weaponry. Douglas's jaw tightened as he realized the implications. Zark's was not just a thief but a dangerous innovator. The quantum nullifier was likely just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the Krenim's destructive capabilities. With renewed urgency, Douglas pressed deeper into the station, the energy rifle now slung across his back. He knew he had to reach Zark's before the quantum nullifier could be activated. The fate of countless lives hung in the balance, and failure was not an option. Douglas pushed deeper into the space station, his blaster at the ready. As he rounded another corner, he found himself face to face with a group of Krenim scientists. Their eyes widened with terror at the sight of the human soldier, and they immediately raised their hands in surrender. "Please don't shoot," one of the scientists pleaded, his voice trembling. "We're not armed. We just work here." Douglas kept his blaster trained on the group, his eyes narrowing. "I'm looking for Zark's. Where is he?" The scientists exchanged nervous glances before one of them, a young Krenim with bright blue eyes, stepped forward. "I can help you find him. My name is Korax. I've worked closely with Zark's, but I never agreed with his methods." Korax swallowed hard. Zark's has become obsessed with the idea of Krenim superiority. He rants about cleansing the galaxy of lesser species. He's been experimenting on captured aliens, using them as test subjects for his weapons. Douglas felt a wave of revulsion wash over him. The thought of innocent beings being used as guinea pigs for Zark's twisted experiments made his blood boil. "Take me to his lab." Korax nodded, and the group set off down the corridor. As they walked, Korax filled Douglas in on the layout of the station and the security measures Zark's had put in place. But suddenly a flicker of movement caught Douglas's eye. He shoved Korax aside just as a figure materialized out of thin air, a gleaming blade slicing through the space where the Krenim's head had been moments before. Douglas found himself surrounded by a group of elite guards, their bodies shimmering with advanced stealth technology. The Shadow Blades, as Korax called them, were Zark's personal guard, trained in close-quarters combat and equipped with the latest in Krenim weaponry. They closed in on Douglas, their blades flashing in the dim light. Douglas holstered his blaster and raised his fists, falling into a fighting stance. The Shadow Blades attacked as one, their movements swift and precise. But Douglas was faster. He dodged and weaved, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to stay one step ahead of their blades. He lashed out with a series of rapid strikes, his fists and feet finding their marks with devastating accuracy. The Shadow Blades fell one by one, their bodies crumpling to the floor. But not before they managed to land a few blows of their own. Douglas winced as he felt the sting of a blade across his ribs and the crunch of a fist connecting with his jaw. But he pushed through the pain, his focus never wavering. He had a mission to complete, and no amount of physical discomfort would stop him. As the last Shadow Blade fell, Douglas turned to Korax, who was staring at him with a mixture of awe and fear. "Impressive," the Krenim said. "I've never seen anyone fight like that." Korax led him to a secret passage, a narrow corridor hidden behind a false wall. They slipped inside, the entrance ceiling shut behind them. The passage bypassed the station's main security systems, allowing them to move undetected. As they approached Zark's lab, Douglas could feel the weight of the galaxy's fate pressing down on him. He knew that the confrontation with the rogue scientist would be the most important battle of his life. The quantum nullifier had to be secured, and Zark's had to be stopped, no matter the cost. Douglas checked his weapons one last time, ensuring that everything was in working order. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Then, with a nod to Korax, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever challenges Zark's had in store. Douglas and Korax burst into Zark's lab, blasters at the ready. The cavernous room was a nightmarish blend of advanced technology and twisted experimentation. Strange machinery hummed and pulsed, casting an eerie glow over the space. Bubbling tanks lined the walls, each containing grotesque, half-formed creatures that twitched and writhed in their artificial wombs. In the center of the lab stood Zark's himself, a towering Krenim with a cybernetic eye that gleamed with malevolent intelligence. A cruel, twisted smile played across his scarred face as he held the quantum nullifier in his hands, the device pulsing with an ominous energy. "Ah," the human Zark said, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "I must congratulate you on making it this far. Your tenacity and skill are truly impressive." Douglas kept his blaster trained on the rogue scientist, his finger hovering over the trigger. "It's over, Zarks. Hand over the nullifier and surrender." Zarks chuckled, a sound that sent chills down Douglas's spine. "Oh, but why would I do that? You see, I've been monitoring your progress through my station, and I must say, I'm fascinated by you. Your kind has such potential, such raw power." The Krenim scientist took a step forward, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on Douglas. "Join me, human. Together we can purify this galaxy, rid it of the weak and unworthy. I will spare your Earth and grant humanity a place of honor in my new order." Disgust twisted in Douglas's gut at the offer. "Go to hell," he spat. "I'd rather die than join a madman like you." Zark's face contorted with rage, his grip tightening on the nullifier. "So be it," he snarled. "If you will not join me, then you will die with the rest of the vermin." With a flick of his wrist, Zarks activated a force field around himself, a shimmering barrier that crackled with energy. At the same time, hidden doors along the lab's walls slid open, revealing a swarm of cybernetically enhanced Krenim warriors, each armed with a miniature version of the quantum nullifier. The warriors surged forward, their mechanical limbs whirring as they closed in on Douglas and Korax. Douglas opened fire, his blaster bolts ricocheting off the warriors' armored hides. Beside him, Korax frantically worked at a nearby console, his fingers flying over the keys as he tried to access the lab systems. Douglas ducked and weaved, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to evade the warriors' attacks. He switched to the advanced energy rifle he had taken from the fallen soldiers, its crimson bolts tearing through the cybernetic abominations. Suddenly, Korax let out a triumphant shout. "I've got it," he cried. "I've hacked into the lab's security systems. I can shut down the warriors' control chips." Korax's fingers danced across the console, and a moment later, the warriors jerked and spasmed, their cybernetic implants shorting out in a shower of sparks. They collapsed to the ground, twitching and writhing as their systems failed. But Zarks was far from defeated. He snarled in rage, his force field still shimmering around him. Douglas scanned the barrier, searching for any weakness he could exploit. There a small fluctuation in the field's energy output, a barely noticeable flicker. Douglas took aim with the energy rifle, pouring all his focus into the shot. The bolt struck the force field dead center, causing it to ripple and waver. For a moment it held, but then, with a crackling hiss, it collapsed, leaving Zarks exposed. Douglas charged forward, dropping his rifle and launching himself at the Krenim scientist. They collided in a tangle of limbs, grappling for control of the quantum nullifier. Zarks was strong, his cybernetic enhancements giving him an edge in raw power, but Douglas was faster. His human reflexes allowed him to slip out of the Krenim's grasp and deliver a devastating series of blows. They fought back and forth across the lab, smashing through equipment and sending sparks flying. The nullifier changed hands again and again, each combatant desperate to claim the deadly device. Douglas ducked under a wild swing from Zarks, then surged upward, his fist connecting with the Krenim's jaw with a satisfying crack. Zarks staggered back, his cybernetic eye flickering. Seizing his chance, Douglas lunged forward, his hands closing around the quantum nullifier. He wrenched it free from Zarks' grasp, then delivered a final, crushing blow to the scientist's temple. Zarks crumpled to the ground, his cybernetic eye going dark. Douglas stood over him, the nullifier held tight in his grip. He was battered and bleeding but victorious. Korax hurried to his side, his eyes wide with awe. "You did it," he breathed. "You defeated Zarks." Douglas nodded, his gaze fixed on the nullifier. "Not just me," he said. "We did it. But this thing, it's too dangerous. We need to destroy it." Korax hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. The galaxy isn't ready for this kind of power. No one should have it together." They turned to face the nullifier, ready to put an end to its threat once and for all. But as Douglas raised the device, preparing to smash it against the ground, a sudden thought struck him. The Galactic Council had sent him to retrieve the nullifier, not destroy it. They wanted this power for themselves to use as they saw fit. Could he trust them with such a terrible weapon? Douglas hesitated, torn between his duty and his conscience. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and the choice he made now would shape its future for generations to come. As Douglas and Zarks grappled for control of the quantum nullifier, their hands locked around the device in a desperate struggle, a stray finger accidentally brushed against the activation switch. The nullifier hummed to life, its core pulsing with an ominous green glow. Suddenly, a blinding flash of energy erupted from the device, engulfing the lab in a sickly green light. The very fabric of reality began to warp and distort around them, the air shimmering like a heat haze. The cybernetically enhanced Kranim warriors, caught in the localized quantum distortion, jerked and spasmed as their circuitry went haywire. They turned on each other in a frenzy of sparking metal and flailing limbs, their programming corrupted by the nullifier's energy. At the same time, the containment tanks lining the walls of the lab shattered under the strain of the distortion, releasing the grotesque, half-formed creatures within. The abominations, twisted and deformed by Zarks' experiments, stumbled forth on misshapen limbs, their cries echoing through the chaos. Douglas, his face bathed in the sickly green glow of the nullifier, gritted his teeth and wrenched the device from Zarks' grasp. The Kranim scientist, his cybernetic eye flickering erratically, howled in rage and lunged at Douglas, his fingers clawing for the nullifier. But Douglas was faster. He sidestepped Zarks' attack, and with a swift motion, pulled the quantum key from his belt. He slammed the key into the nullifier's control panel, twisting it sharply. The device shuddered in his hands, the green glow fading as the quantum distortion began to dissipate. The lab was in ruins, the malfunctioning warriors lay in sparking heaps, their mechanical limbs twitching feebly. The escaped creatures, caught in the crossfire of the warriors' self-destruction, lay still and lifeless on the floor. Korax, his face streaked with sweat and grime, called out to Douglas over the din of groaning metal and hissing steam. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "The lab's structure is failing. It's going to collapse any second." Douglas nodded, his gaze sweeping the room for an exit. But as he turned to run, a massive beam, dislodged by the quantum distortion, crashed down from the ceiling, pinning Zarks to the floor. The Kranim scientist screamed in pain, his legs crushed beneath the twisted metal. For a moment Douglas hesitated, his instincts warring within him. Every fiber of his being urged him to run, to leave Zarks to his fate and save himself. But something held him back, a flicker of humanity perhaps, or a sense of duty to the mission. With a growl of frustration, Douglas turned back and grabbed the edge of the beam, his muscles straining as he heaved upward, his enhanced strength barely enough to lift the massive weight. Beside him, Korax added his own strength to the effort, his face contorted with exertion. Together, they managed to raise the beam just enough for Douglas to drag Zarks free. The Kranim scientist, his face pale with pain, looked up at Douglas with a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. There was no time for words. Douglas hauled Zarks to his feet, slinging the scientist's arm over his shoulder. With Korax leading the way, they staggered out of the collapsing lab, dodging falling debris and sparking wires. They burst out into the corridor just as the lab imploded behind them, a rush of heat and flame chasing at their heels. The force of the blast slammed into their backs, sending them sprawling to the floor. Douglas rolled to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. He shook his head to clear it, then reached,